Amy, and we're back with Wired for Change. What happens when transformation meets tradition at national scale? What does it take to lead change in a system built for another era? How do you measure success when profit isn't the goal? In today's episode, I'm joined by Derek Dobson, veteran, strategist, and thought leader in defense innovation and leadership in Canada. From his early military days to his current work, helping defense institutions to navigate change, Derek brings a unique combination, or a very rare combination, of lived experience and systems-level insight. Together, we're going to dive into what makes transformation difficult, but also worthwhile in the defense sector, and what and why it matters beyond the battlefield. Thank you so much, Derek, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about your journey and how you were drafted into digital transformation.
Yeah, of course. So career-wise, there are really two major parts of my journey so far. One was in the military, so I served in the British Army and the Canadian Armed Forces. And then afterwards, I've been in the private sector, really in consulting and in technology companies. So I've had the joy of working in some pretty large organizations that have been fundamentally going through large changes. And of course, the thread that brings them all together is digital technology. So with that, I'd say that my journey into tech itself was not a voluntary one. Whilst I was in the Army, I was an infantry officer, which is pretty operationally focused and really focused on people and equipment and doing things with that. But at one point, I was told, pretty much against my will, that I was going to go into a specialism inside my staff branch, as it were, to learn more about digital technology so that I'd be better rounded to understand how the enterprise was changing and how we were going to use tech to change the way that we were doing things. And they were very clear that they wanted operators to be leading that change rather than technologists. So that was where it all started.
And what was your reaction to that?
Yeah, I'll be honest, it was fairly visceral. I was very clear that I felt I was in the operations side of things rather than the technology piece. And I really, like many, I think, looked at the technologists who were absolutely essential and very clever, but somewhat boffin-like as being the land of intellectuals, or those who like to play with things rather than get things done. I couldn't have been more wrong. And as I learned about how technologies were developed and fielded and supported, I learned that clearly the most important thing is to be able to articulate what you want the tech to do, and then everyone can draft in behind you and get that done. And I think that was great.
It's very clever of them to really bring people who have that lived experience in order to shape kind of the future. I always feel like you can't have a transformation without it, or a successful kind of adoption without having that co-design element to things. Are there things that you brought forward specifically about from your military service that shapes how you think about transformation today?
Yeah, I think as we were discussing a few minutes ago, I was very clear at the beginning of my career that there was a period where we called out attitude to change and thought it was something that was really important to be able to identify in people and say, you must understand that this is an important thing and we must get through to you on the skills and sort of competencies required to lead change. That is true, but we quickly went away to the fact that we became alert to the fact that it's endemic. Change is endemic, and therefore it's about your comfort with the way that we're actually operating. Your operating model has to change constantly. You're self-disrupting, as it were. And if you haven't got that level of agility, then you're probably not really well equipped to lead an organization in its own right if you're trying to stay within bounds. And not that you wouldn't be able to manage and apply resources to tasks to get them done. That's one thing. But leading and to be able to keep the organization vibrant and have the ability to move on to the next task and think about the changing world around you, I think that was really born into my early experience, especially when outcomes were anything but certain and you had to actually understand and react to the environment around you.
Is that something you naturally embraced, or is that something where you had some early lessons that you learned that really helped you?
Yeah, I'll be honest. When you go through your early training in the military, in particular, you're taught drills. Really, you're taught to repeat and repeat and repeat tasks to the point that they're almost automatic. That you really are self-automating. Whether it's the handling of equipment or understanding the problem set around you. And we all have to understand those tasks so that we can very quickly see how we're doing things in relation to each other. But what becomes very clear very quickly is that when reality hits, things very rarely go according to the plan or according to the way that the process is meant to move through. So I think the first few times, for instance, you're in contact, which is when someone is actually trying to, forcibly deflect you from your task, you realize very quickly you have to adapt, and it's not going to work exactly the way you expected it to. But because everyone has a common baseline of understanding, they can see when you have made a change and when you're doing something very deliberately different, and they understand the end point that you're trying to get to. And that to see that come together with a team around you that have very different skill sets and often very different trades or capabilities, but have a common goal and can see what you're trying to achieve. I found that inspiring at the beginning, and I learned from everyone around me. I thought it was just an amazing thing to see. And so I was always really, really seized by the need to learn those skills and to move them forward.
When I think about the military, and we talked about this a little bit before, I think that, well, everyone just sort of does whatever they're supposed to do, right? So can they just change on command, or is it actually challenging for them as well?
No, well, that's an interesting point in its own right. The military institution is always perceived as a very command and control orientated sort of organization.
If it's anywhere, it's there. Right?
100%. People say turn to the right, you're going to turn to the right. Stand up, stand up. That's the way it works. And to an extent, that works in barracks and when in the institution, and when you're trying to, manage your department and to apply resources and to get things done. As I was saying, you're managing a task. But actually, fundamentally, all of the military, certainly of the Western armies, are designed around a philosophy called mission command. And all of that is about explaining to people what the intent is of what you're trying to do, what the end state is in a common vision of what we're trying to achieve, allocating a mission, and then really encouraging everybody to decompose that mission in their heads and find the solution that meets the task. And so mission command is really inherently built around understanding that mission, but also having the authority to change it should the tactical situation be such that it isn't relevant. As long as you understand what's being asked of you and what you're trying to achieve as a team, you can change on the ground and you don't have to do what you were told to do. In fact, you shouldn't do it if it's not going to help you achieve the aim.
So you have that clarity of intent, and then also sort of that autonomy and that ability to own kind of the decisions as well, which is really interesting. Is that something that's taught intentionally as part of how to communicate?
Oh, very much so. From the earliest schools for officers and non-commissioned officers, as soon as leaders are taught one thing, they're taught this concept of mission command and how to ask themselves personal questions, to decompose the words that you've just been told, and then to come up with a plan. And that's actually very deliberately based on a philosophy called Taktik, which was modeled off of the German army with its success in maneuverism at the Second World War, when others were struggling to keep pace with them.
I really like that. I've worked in a lot of environments where I feel like that would have been really helpful. We've really struggled with that in the past. So, what would you say is actually what is more difficult when it comes to change? Like, what is uniquely difficult when it comes to change with respect to defense?
I think there are a couple of pieces. One is that in defense institutions themselves, they're actually twin solitudes. There's the department, which supports the armed forces, and then the armed forces themselves. And that's the same for every government. And the department is responsible for the good stewardship of resources on behalf of the population of the country, of Canada, etc. And it runs very much in line with any other enterprise or organization within government. It has an HR function, an IT function, a real property function, procurement function, etc. And within that, they obviously have to go through their good stewardship and principles to manage their resources and always have good control over that. But at the same time, you have the armed forces, which are actually a legally separate entity who have a very different mission sense in that they themselves are designed to obviously achieve the aims of the defense of the country, the population, and the country's interests. And whilst there isn't a conflict in there, there is a difference when it comes to the attitude to risk operationally, how things should be done in terms of achieving outcomes, that mission command piece that I was talking about. And of course, when you take people from the military themselves into the piece at the center, where they have to actually interact with the civilian organization, and the civilian organization is very much in command, then they have to learn themselves this new language of how to operate at the enterprise level. And often they're not very well suited to do that. So it tends to slow things down. It's not willful, There's absolutely no, well, they're great teams.
No.
Like they're integrated as one great team, but they have very different experiences. And getting that to jibe in a common sense with a sense of urgency is somewhat difficult.
So what are some strategies that you employ to help support that?
I think, and you see this across the institutions themselves, like D&D and the Canadian Armed Forces, those two pieces together have great leaders. They do have great leaders, absolutely fantastic. And they're seized of common purpose. Often it's about helping them to recognize that purpose and what it means to have others to come in to help. And I think of the technology piece in particular. You can see where it either from a policy perspective or a procedural perspective for the acquisition of those capabilities, often there'll be discussions about what you can and can't do in relation to the use of the technology or how it should be procured. And to be honest, both of those twin solitudes I was describing are speaking into a void. They don't necessarily understand either how the technology is developed, deployed, and used, or how it should be purchased. You know, how it's commercially, how the commercial engagements work. And where there's a void and there's confusion, often there's a reluctance to move. And that's for good reason. Yeah. I mean, there's a risk and there's no way to mitigate it if you feel that you can't move on. And I think what happens best is when all of those senior players will come together to speak honestly and transparently without obfuscating what the real task is, which is clearly to enable the Canadian Armed Forces to achieve their mission. That's the important thing.
Some of us require some good facilitation at the right place and the right time.
I think when we have the ability to do so, and obviously recognizing too that the risks that I was describing are very much owned by the senior executives in each of the organizations that you're dealing with, respecting the authority that they have and the responsibility too, we can advise and help. The burden of responsibility lies on the shoulders of those senior leaders. And therefore recognizing that respectfully, I think there's the opportunity to challenge and to lead and to educate and to help make sure that we transparently and without self-interest are helping to set the defense team up for success.
I've spoken with many guests who talk about sort of the burden of, the many decisions and changes that are facing, us today. Would you say that that's the same for leaders in defense? Just an increased, scale of decisions and just being informed on AI and other topics that are changing and trying to make the right decision in those circumstances? Or is it just kind of always been that way?
I think to an extent it's always been this way, in that I was describing the operational environment before, which has always been in flux and will always be in flux. Sadly, people are always finding new ways to fight each other and to do terrible things to each other. So with that comes change, and it has done throughout centuries or millennia of the human experience. The accelerated pace of that change that's come with the fourth industrial revolution is somewhat bewildering. And what we see now is the fact that industry and the civilian world, the application of technologies is somewhat ahead of where the military is, except for those nations that are in conflict, sadly. And that really leads to an odd position where a lot of the innovation that we enjoy in civilian life has usually had some connection to government funding for defense programs in the past.
Yes. Now
that's inversed. And I think that it's an interesting piece.
It is a really interesting piece. And we touched on that in our early conversations. And the same is true for healthcare, I would say, where we can't keep up with the consumer-like experiences that people are expecting. Maybe you could paint a picture for us a little bit of some of the landscape of what's changing today for defense. Like what are we facing here in Canada?
I think it's the same thing that's occurring to all nations, and especially the NATO nations in particular. You can see that historically, defense was, certainly from the Industrial Revolution onwards, was very much focused on large, exquisite platforms and how many of them you had. You'd spend a lot of money on ships and a lot of money on planes and a lot of money on tanks, etc. And you'd see, well, you could almost play like a game of strategy or chess, that you could say, how many does this organization have and that one? How can you bolt them together? Then what effect can you have with that combined group? But that was very much based on the physical sense that you had a finite number of physical components in your fighting power. Now, the other piece to that is conceptual, in that how can you leverage information to understand more of what's happening around you and have a multiplication effect on the physical force that you have. And so we've gone from a world where it's certainly there's no walking back from the fact that there's a physical component to defense. There's absolutely none of that. And there will always be there. But we see those platforms as actually computers that fly, float, and drive. They have a huge number of sensors over them. Mm-hmm. They generate a bewildering amount of data that actually creates almost decision paralysis if there's too much for it. Mm-hmm. And you need systems that allow the human being to sense, make sense, decide, and act in the operational space. And that is the big shift. So we've gone from platforms, being platform-centric, to then deciding to connect those platforms through networks. So there was a period for about 10, 20 years when we were in network-centric warfare and defense was important. Now we're in the data-centric world, where we can see we've got so much data that really is the age of AI. And I think that's where we're at. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's a lot to look at there for sure. What is the level of maturity you think we're at right now with respect to thinking about AI, and what do you think is has a lot of potential in your mind?
Well, it depends on the domain, to be perfectly honest, and it depends on where we're using or which country is using those technologies. Some that are clearly in conflict, like Ukraine is clearly an example of where commercially available digital dual-use technologies is being leveraged greatly to help them to hold the line in a really difficult circumstance. And there are others that people would recognize straight away from news stories. But I think where we see the levels of maturity within the force there are 5 warfighting domains: land, air, sea, space, cyber. You could look at the cyber domain, for instance, and think, well, that is clearly now part of where we have to live and fight and work. But actually, there's a war going on in the cyber domain every day. Large cloud service providers defend against up to 9,000 attacks from nation-state actors a minute. They monitor 123 trillion security signals a day. That clearly artificial intelligence is taking care of most of that monitoring and a lot of the decision-making and response. And humans simply can't work at that speed or anywhere close to it. Sadly, that will become true in the physical domains as well. And you can see where advances are being made with automation, with ground, air, or maritime platforms. And you can see how advantage is being made there. Again, if you take that back to the use of autonomous systems that are able to find their target, but not uncrewed systems that might be or might not be autonomous, but they certainly can help with the acquisition and engagement of a target. You could say in the Ukraine, in the maritime domain, without any real navy, they've managed to neutralize a major nation's, one of their fleets. The Black Sea Fleet is not strategically capable of operating. That's through the use of digital technologies largely. And other nations are learning those lessons and trying to keep up. And with a bit of focus, you can see in patches where experimentation has led to an uplift and then moving forward faster. So that's important. But I should stress, I very quickly rotate into that operational use of technology. I suppose that's because where I started. Mm-hmm. But of course, there are large organizations. If you look at a defense department here in Canada, it's the 11th province, really. It's got healthcare system, it's got schools and schoolhouses, all of these pieces, a legal system, a police force. Mm-hmm. Technology enters all parts of life, and just as it does in civilian life and other parts of civil society, it affects those areas too. So use cases can come across between them there as well.
That's true. Fair enough. Mm-hmm. That's all right. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's a way of thinking or a model of thinking or different elements that you have to think about when it comes to digital and the impact that digital has on anything? Or even if you look at cyber and how it impacts every domain, for example, it's not just sort of staying in one, or the exponential sort of the exponential risk. So, we always had risk in kind of digital transformation and digital change. But if you add AI, well, it's kind of an exponential opportunity, but it's exponential risk as well. So do you have different ways of thinking about it, or do you think it requires more systems thinking than perhaps we had before, for instance?
I think it certainly involves systems thinking, not least because those digital technologies are commercially controlled in a very different way to technologies or solutions that you could purchase and use. So everything that's provided as a service, of course, implies a level of service agreement between yourself and a commercial provider. And if those commercial providers are dominated by one or two nations, then in a defense sense, that becomes problematic because you're not always going to see eye to eye, and you do require some degree of autonomy or sovereignty to do as you wish to do. So despite the requirement to deal with all this data, leverage AI models, etc., when you look at the infrastructure requirements to support them, they're not necessarily optimized at the national level.
That's right.
And that's problematic, at least the changes as you're thinking through that. So that's one level of complexity. And if that's the case, it actually turns to the resilience conversation, which is similar to cyber. If you were experiencing a cyber attack and you went offline, then you will have a recovery point objective and a recovery time objective, and you'd see how you're actually going to go through that degree of resilience planning. Well, if you're entirely invested in using dual-use technologies that are supranational, you may be in a position, whether it's through attack or through policy choice and divergence, having to figure out very quickly, how do you get back to a recovery point which is acceptable to maintain your minimal level of service? And so to an extent, there's a read across between those two models, and understanding that can be complex.
Yeah, I really like that. And how we measure, success, I think is part of that as well. When we think about resilience in a lot of different areas, I think we have to relook at some of those things and ensure that we're being proactive with respect to resilience in a way that maybe Canada hasn't always been. But it's great at some things, for sure.
Many things. Canada has the great joy of having been geographically and societally protected for a very long time, and therefore we enjoy a great standard of life and standard of living, and it's a very peaceful nation. We just have to recognize at the same time that a lot of these threats are real, extant, and sadly ongoing, and therefore just be realistic about what's happening around us and make some decisions.
I think that's a good way to put it. You've talked about on LinkedIn, you've talked about ROI. And measures of ROI. I was wondering if you could get into that a little bit and maybe talk a little bit about how we've measured ROI to date and maybe some things that you would suggest we could adjust or change.
Sure. I think...
and why?
Yeah. I was spurred on when I was thinking about that most recently by obviously the conversations we're all aware of in the news about how much nations are committing from their GDP to defense. And that's an important matter for everyone to consider as a citizen, whether we're comfortable with that or not, and what level of risk we're taking. But certainly when you start to get to a large percentage, 5% or 3.5% plus 1.5, as depending how you measure it, of your GDP, you start to create an expectation that you will get some capability out of this. And to the point we were just having, what does Canada really feel it needs to defend? If a lot of people aren't seized with the geopolitical situation, etc., and they don't necessarily see how that investment in the military will protect them. And so I think what comes with that is there's two complexities there. One is that you create a honeypot effect where people think, well, I like to do business with the government, but the government's shrinking in many areas, but it's investing in defense. So I'll just see how many of my solutions I can force into that area to say that they're relevant, and I'll get something out of it. And by the same token, on the other hand, you get a lot of investment into programs that you'll say, well, I can see that what you're after, but they don't actually deliver anything. They don't deliver any new capability. So when I was talking about it recently, I was saying, well, 5% invested in defense is fine, and you could end up spending a lot of money on great projects that are relevant, like fixing the roads on bases or improving housing for families, all super relevant. There's no question about that. But Canada has very little combat power and cannot necessarily meet the requirements of today's geopolitical situation. So we could get to 5% investment and meet a lot of people's job creation targets and satisfy a lot of great companies without actually improving the lot of the Canadian Armed Forces, or perhaps improving their lot, but not necessarily their ability to achieve their mission. So when I was looking at investments, I was thinking through, how do you measure the shift in capability? Now, there's a dreadful term that is very common in defense and is difficult to hear in commercial companies about increasing lethality for the armed forces. It's really that force multiplication effect, or certainly doing things like you can measure not just the amount of targets they can engage, but how likely they are to be able to neutralize that target without missing. So does that show an improvement? How fast can they move from one task to the next? Does that show an improvement? How can we be sure that they are available for more time? So how can we maintain them and sustain the forces so that they don't run out of steam if they could previously run out of steam after 48 hours, if we increase that to 72 hours, that's a significant impact. So those are the returns on investment you see, rather than certainly the commercial aspect of a profit, but also helps you to avoid that spend on things that are other than core competency related. And I think that's where I'd go.
Okay. And then there are some is there a strategy that these measures might flow from, for example?
Yeah, sure. What's interesting is, again, it comes down to those pieces I was talking about, the slight difference between the two entities, the department and the military, because the department, certainly within each government, and certainly the Canadian government, report on their priorities and plans into the central government and to Parliament. And they say what they were trying to achieve, and then they look at the programmatic spend and how well they have achieved those pieces. Now, defence has been missing their targets for a very long time, and land readiness, air readiness, etc., each of those areas. I think readiness in itself is sometimes used as a bit of a panacea or a bit of a macro bucket. How many of our people are healthy? Certainly that's a readiness check, but how many of them are trained and equipped and ready to go right now? And then how many can we sustain in the field? That's a different metric. Same with platforms, etc. And how well are they trained together? There are a lot of all that to say that there are many layers of the metrics that you need to get to kind of figure out. And that in its own right can become problematic. Measuring things gets things done until you start to measure everything.
Right.
And then nothing's important. And so you really have to focus. I interviewed the Chief Transformation Officer recently from the Royal Navy, and he was clear that lethality was the measure for each of the programs that they were on. And if a project couldn't deliver a 6x increase in lethality in 6, 18, or 24 months, and depending on what they were being asked to do, then the project was cancelled.
Interesting.
And I thought that was, whilst it was quite a brutalist way to lead, it was focused.
Sometimes I've seen companies more successful with innovation when they've been, more disciplined in terms of killing things or stopping things. Yeah. It's really interesting to see the impact of that, which is why I think measures of ROI can be so important. So you mentioned something, a term called tourism, I guess, that we were talking around just now. How do you think about, how to welcome innovation without inviting tourism? And maybe you could explain what that means a little bit in this context.
Yeah, I'll be clear. When I was writing a paper on this recently, I was listening to Spotify and music, and up came from the algorithm Pulp's Common People. So it was that line about everybody hates a tourist, especially one who thinks it's such a laugh. Right. And I was thinking that through that, everyone being drawn to that honeypot of money to invest in. I think those who are trying to basically keep their business alive by simply thinking this is another market to go into, that's one thing. Others who are trying to build a business which is about innovating for that end is different in its own right. If you look at the best examples, I suppose there are large ones like Palantir, who started out and have dominated very quickly in the digital space from AI use, starting in the intelligence and defense world. But also companies like Anduril that were created basically to use a software-defined approach to defense rather than a hardware one, looking at capabilities built onto digital technology. So you can see how quickly a company can scale and become really leading in its field. But how do we do that for the small and medium enterprises in an ecosystem like Canada, where for a long time we have been absolutely in a position where if you want to create a company which innovated in the defense space, they would have to sell outside Canada first and then come back. Yes. If they could survive long enough with an overseas contract, they might get through the procurement system, which will take many years to do business with the government of Canada. All of that has to change. We have to incubate and move faster.
It does. Any other words of advice, either from a procurement perspective or for small and medium companies who are innovating and trying to work with the federal government or with defense? Any advice for them? Because that is a topic that we've touched on this podcast in terms of the the lack of support for innovation that we've had for many years. And now, there are many initiatives trying to stimulate, our innovation economy, because we've got lots of great innovators here. But as you said, they usually have to go somewhere else. Any thoughts on how we can help them, or how, they can move forward?
Yeah, I think the government tries to work, has got a few good systems. They do an ideas program, a challenge-based program, which just sets out a challenge and companies can compete to move forward. And there's a definite effort to favor small and medium enterprises that are trying to scale their solutions and build them and go through various gates. Sadly, there's no way for them to take that to scale with an actual enterprise contract at the end of it,
right,
which would be a pretty easy fix, I would imagine, to go from one to the other. If you're saying that, if you've won, proven out the ability to scale,
yes,
and we've used our seed money to get you to that point, then we should be able to actually take you through to a contract. So that's one piece. But then also inside that, there are good signs in that there are an increasing number of specialist venture capitalists who are helping small and medium enterprises in Canada to work in the defense space and to get there. It's a very capital intensive business, though, when you're trying to get to scale in defense. And more power to them.
Yeah, it is very capital intensive. Yeah, no, for sure. Creative ways to do that and to nurture that entrepreneurship and get it to the next level, so it gets beyond that point of, well, it's an innovation and there was a POC and that was kind of it, right? Yeah. That's scaling kind of an idea. What ways of working do you find have been successful for the defense sector to partner externally with the private sector specifically?
Well, as I was mentioning, the challenge-based approach, I think that has been proven to work well in many countries. So Canada's got a version of it. Getting it to scale is somewhat different. The US has been very, very good with that. I mean, to be honest, no country does defense procurement very well. It's a bugbear everywhere. Okay. But in the US, they changed recently in the recognition of the need for digital technologies to use other transactional authorities, which are just a very different approach to acquiring digital technologies that can be scaled. In that they'll set out a challenge, go through their various gates. Those challenges, as they're run through, are almost unlike badgeless collaboration. So companies are competing against each other, but collaborating in a sense in others. But the contracts can be awarded very quickly, and you see things like, I suppose I'll get this slightly wrong. I'm sure someone could fact check me. But a few years ago, when Microsoft won the IVAS project to provide head-up display for the US Army, that subsequently moved out, but it was an $18 to $20 billion program that was created from an experimental challenge over a period of 18 months. So there was a degree of appetite and ambition that was met with capital, and you could move forward. Now, they were building on a failed program that had been moving before, but you can see how that creates the conditions for companies to be willing to invest time and effort to go at that speed.
Absolutely. I love it. I love looking at things that have been successful in other countries and thinking about how we can apply them for ourselves. That's great. Let's talk about leadership a little bit. I was wondering if you could tell us a story about a leader that you've worked with who was particularly successful with how they drove change or transformation and the impact it had on you.
Yeah, certainly. Now, I would say, so I would look at things in a couple of different domains. So from a military perspective, obviously I had very clear relationships with my leaders throughout time. And I've always been inspired by those who really lived what I was talking about before about mission command. So we're very clear and direct about what they were trying to achieve, what the outcome had to be, and then empowered you to move on. And I think that is probably a given, which is absolutely fine. What I was interested in, though, as well, is when I came to the commercial world, I've been lucky enough to work in the largest sort of consulting firms and technology firms around, very prestigious ones. And when I go back to, I did work for Microsoft for a while, and I looked at the way that company had changed around under the leadership of one person. Satya Nadella is quite an inspirational individual. When you look at the size, scope, and scale of that organization, I think there are 1.7, 1.3 billion people who use their technology, hundreds of millions of enterprises. It wasn't always necessarily going on a linear path to growth. There have been problems throughout each generation of technology, as it were. And they had missed things. They missed the cloud piece at the beginning. They certainly missed cellular telephone sort of approach to things. But Satya managed to actually deliberately attack both the cultural model upon which the company was sitting and its strategy at the same time. Changed it to a cloud-based company, built a cloud, moved his own company to it, and then commercialized that. But very deliberately and consciously took it from being what he described as a know-it-all company to a learn-it-all company. And I thought that was quite amazing. And inside the company, that was a deliberate choice, which you could see as leaders and managers and executives across the piece as being built into with how we were doing our training, how we were doing our development of other individuals, how we were rewarding people. And I thought that was super interesting. That said...
Well, how did you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so...
What did that look like?
Yeah, I'll tell you. So to a large extent, inside the organization, the rewards will come in three parts, really. There's your base salary, for instance. There's the commissions that you would earn on your piece on productivity, etc. Then the third element is actually based on a measure of your cultural contribution, for want of a better word. So it's how well you performed against your tasks, etc., but also how much you've done to help others to succeed. How much of your success is attributable to your willingness to learn from others and to have brought other people into your projects and tasks, and that sort of thing. So even at that level, it's built into the organization. And that's, to be fair, that's one of the companies I've worked with. I've only been with 3. I know there are other great examples out there in the digital sector and others too. Mm-hmm.
Well, I just love stories about that. I think people can learn a lot from stories and storytelling. So that's great. And sorry, I interrupted you. You were going to say something else?
No, not at all. I think, as you would imagine, there are many great leaders that I've worked with in the military sense. And I think to a large extent, I think people somewhat have a Hollywoodized version of what a military commander would be like, almost a Patton-esque figure standing in front of a flag and marching around ordering things through. But I know that as a 21-year-old leading 20 plus, I think it was around 24 soldiers in operations in Northern Ireland, I found myself within hours really deploying onto the ground in a leadership position with, sadly bombs going off and people shooting at us. Yeah. But the man who I felt was very mature and senior to me would have been 32 probably if he was lucky. Wow. And I did feel he was massively, I thought he was massively serious and senior. But quite often in the middle of the night, if we're out there sitting by walls out expecting to move to the next thing, you just feel his hand on your shoulder and then you could see him looking at you in the eyes. He wouldn't say anything, just make sure you're okay and you'd move off. And I think that physical presence was everything. He was a very soft-spoken and very quiet person and often quite dour. But actually knowing he was there was really important all of the time.
That's beautiful. It really is. How do you balance humility, reflection, and conviction when making high-stakes decisions, like in the situation you were talking about?
I think it's always important to, so I love stories. I have a terrible tendency to take a lot of people's time up with stories. But I think realizing that the story itself is more important than your part in it is pretty key to being a leader. What I mean by that is when you're leading a group of people, I think we've gotten used to the idea. I think Simon Sinek wrote his book around Leaders Eat Last. Well, that's a very military norm. We deliberately see all the soldiers through so you're sure that they have had the nutrition and then you can go through. That's a good leadership principle as much as it is a practical action to take. But so you think that that's become important, and servant leadership has become something that is important. I went to an academy that for well over 100 years had a motto of serve to lead. That's natural to us as well. I think all of that is natural, but actually it doesn't always get brought to fruition or to its natural embodiment if someone still thinks of themselves as the important part of that team. I am the leader, I am the quarterback, I am the coach. Certainly, but you're only in that role because you're part of a system. Your role is that particular task within the system of individuals. There will always be someone else to come after you, and there should be someone to come after you, and you should be looking constantly to make sure that you are replaced by someone who's even better than you. And there will be someone in the team that is better than you, so you might as well embrace that and bring them up and get them ready to go. And I think that's the important thing. The team exists and may be led by you, but you are only there as a function of that organization and that ecosystem. And I think that's those are the great leaders I see around me who really are seized by that purpose.
I really love that. Thank you. It's a great way to frame it that is easy to understand. What are you worried about and what are you excited about when it comes to the defense sector and the place that we're at right now as we look out?
I think on one hand, as somebody who's been in defense and intelligence and national security for an entire career, I'm obviously quite excited by the fact that people are interested in it.
Lots of attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's great. It's actually probably a worry in its own right that it should be necessary for people to think that way. I mean, in an ideal world, we don't have to, and we can leave that to those who do spend their careers considering all those issues. With that come a lot of confusing voices, though, because people haven't necessarily immersed themselves in all of the details and the practicalities of what's involved in defense or intelligence operations, and there are competing interests. Early on, I remember the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, sitting through several lessons and study groups, and we'd go through, what does it mean to defend liberal democracy? Well, it's not an easy thing because there's a constant tension. In a liberal democracy, ideally, you don't need anyone to be in your security services or defense organizations, but you do. And so how do you get to the point where the population is able to give sensible and coherent directions through their elected representatives to an organization that must make compromise, but at the same time to meet their requirements, but at the same time meet their mission goals, which are not necessarily what someone would want to do. So when you end up in that world, you can get to a practical position that is exacerbated by the influx of technology, where a discussion around privacy seems to be more important than the ability to link a sensor to an effector.
Right. Maybe you could mention the dog tag kind of story we were talking about as well.
Yeah, sure. I'd say I was mentioning that 20 years ago, at least 20 years ago, we were experimenting in theatre with dog tags, which basically had your digital records on your electronic health records were on your dog tags, so that you could inevitably at the point of injury, first point of injury, the first medic that got to you would be able to digitally connect you to the system, so that as you were triaged and moved backwards, and everybody knew about your whole health history, and you could have all the support you require, from blood type to all of the necessary things. So there's a little more information than you would have with, APOS on your dog tags, and that would be natural. But of course, despite the actual eminent importance of that, from the ability to control whose records were with whom in what theatre and how things were being supported, despite the importance of it and the intense practicality of that, we're still in a world where I know that my documents were, let's say, in a hospital in a cardboard box, because of privacy requirements. And I think that's the same in the civilian world as we were there. But why? And don't get me wrong, I understand the concerns, and we could have a long ethical debate on both sides of that.
Sure.
And I'm not a legislator, so I'm not inside all of it. But when you're getting in the way of actual practical delivery of effect, I think it turns a philosophical conversation into a hurdle which is preventing progress. Though, of course, other people could make very different decisions, saying that, the progress itself could be deleterious.
It's not easy. There's nothing that you can just take, at face value these days. And I think that it's been great to talk with you, because you're able to zoom in, but you're also able to see the bigger picture, and everything's got multiple sides to it right now, and it's constantly evolving. So I really appreciate your time today. There's lots to be excited about, but lots to be concerned or thoughtful about, and you're a very, very thoughtful voice out there, and I hope you continue to put out all the content that you do, and that we're able to stay in touch. Do you have any last sort of words of advice for people who are now sort of waking up to the idea of the defense sector and what does it need in Canada, and perhaps aren't aware of all of the complexities?
No, I think it's an encouraging time when people have the capability to interact together. And we were talking before about the ability to create an increased corpus of knowledge. 10, 15 years ago, there were as many people who are seized by the requirements of geopolitical security as there are today inside the core group. You go to any think tanks, they've always been there having those conversations. But people can interact with all of that knowledge now and create their own opinions and interact and share and shape policy and decisions that are made as we go forward. So I just think it's great that we're having this conversation, that other people interact online. Certainly, I'm always open to discussions. I learn from other people.
You have been very open, online, and that's great. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Derek.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to Wired for Change. And if you're interested in change or understanding the evolving state of affairs in our world, I would encourage you to subscribe to our channel and continue the conversation. Thank you. Take care.